We're here to talk with Daniel Greenfield about his book, Domestic Enemies. What could be more of a relevant title? And then the subtitle is The Founding Fathers Fight Against the Left, which of course, why did they have to fight against the left? Because the left has been fighting against us. Daniel, we had spoken about how to begin, and originally we were going to talk about Bastille Day, but again, in the context of what we're seeing right now and the left's fight against America, can you just put what happened yesterday in the context of how the left has been waging war for a couple hundred years?
Absolutely. Now, I have to admit that I was worried when I was going to do this event on Thursday because I have a book about the left's 200-year-plus war against America. I have a book about the story of leftist violence, and there was no violence. For the first time, we actually had bipartisan unity, Republicans and Democrats coming together around the idea that Biden is senile, a dementia case, and unfit to lead America. What was I even going to talk about? We were in this golden age. CNN and the New York Times now sounded like Fox News had. Michael Moore was saying the Democratic Party is guilty of elder abuse. It was an age of miracles. We were all coming together. We all believed the same thing. And then Saturday happened. And you know what? When everybody asks me, what do I think is going to happen in the election? What do you predict? Who's going to win?
Trump.
From your mouth to God's ears. But what I tell them is I'm not going to predict who's going to win. What I will predict is there will be violence. There will be blood. There will be violence because that is what the left does. The left engages in violence systematically over and over again. I can tell you any election year, 2024, 2026, 28, what's going to happen? There will be riots. Do you know how I know that? Because there have been BLM riots targeted to every single election year. Somehow no drug dealer ever gets shot in an off year. Doesn't happen. 2021, nothing's going on. 2019, nothing's going on. 2020, we must riot in the streets. Say his name. Rest in power. And now we had Hamas. If we hadn't had the Hamas attack on Israel and the whole Gaza war, would there have been riots anyway? Anybody? What do you think? Yes. It would have been over abortion. It would have been over the climate. It would have been over the cost of pizza. There would have been riots. You know, my favorite moment in the French election, which was obviously horrible, but they had riots before that, before they won. Then they won, and they had more riots because rioting is what the left does. Right. The elections are not the point. The left is not interested in elections. The left is interested in riots because its goal is to seize power. And its goal is to seize power violently because that is how you really know you've seized power. Violence is not just the means, it's the ends. So what happened, of course, this Saturday does not surprise me at all. It was only a matter of time. And as I discussed in Domestic Enemies, this is what the left has been doing for a very, very long time. You know, a lot of people don't realize the Secret Service, really our first federal law enforcement agency, which was a controversial concept at the time, crazy of course, because why would anybody ever distrust a federal law enforcement agency? But the Secret Service was really the first one, and it actually got the job of protecting presidents after a leftist anarchist assassinated President McKinley. A lot of people don't necessarily know that. And Theodore Roosevelt, who became president at that point, actually had a great quote, and he said, when compared with the suppression of anarchy, every other question sinks into insignificance. And when he said the suppression of anarchy, he meant anarchists. He meant the left. So Theodore Roosevelt came out and said that fighting the left is really the #1 priority for America. And it still is. This is not a new problem. A lot of people think that the left or the leftist violence is something that emerged in the 60s or it emerged in the 20s, or maybe, okay, it emerged in the 1880s and the 1890s. Those were kind of highlights to some degree, but the left was here all along. Leftist violence was here all along, and that's really the topic of my book. Now, the Secret Service was really empowered to protect presidents, beginning with the leftist assassination of President McKinley. What has the Secret Service been doing? It's been doing diversity. It's been focused on making sure there are 30% of the Secret Service personnel are going to be 5'2" women who are going to be completely unable to shield a man who is over 6 feet. And God knows we never have presidents who are over 6 feet. So they're eminently qualified for the job. The Secret Service is focused on equity. It's focused on, empowering the LGBTQ community. like every part of the federal government now, it's not, of course, empowered to focus on stopping the left, which was its job from the very beginning. You know, a really fun anecdote is one of the things that President Trump wanted to do for Alaska was to bring back the name of Mount McKinley, named after President McKinley, who had been assassinated by a leftist. And of course, the left did not want that because you recognize, you remember the name of McKinley, and then you have to remember the fact that there was a leftist who shot him all along. And there's a long line of leftist assassins who came after presidents, who came after senators. You want a really shocking perspective on the attempted assassination of President Trump? In the last 7 years, leftists have targeted Republicans across every branch of government. There was an assassination attempt against, come on, anybody? Justice Kavanaugh. Stephen Scalise and Justice Kavanaugh both. So you had James Hodgkinson, a Bernie Sanders supporter, who came to the Congressional Republican baseball game. He had a list of House Freedom Caucus members in his pocket. He opened fire. Yes, he did shoot Representative Stephen Scalise, and the FBI, our wonderful federal law enforcement agency, came out and said, well, he was just trying to commit suicide. There is no evidence whatsoever that he was in any shape or form targeting those people whose names he had on the list. No, he was trying to commit suicide. You know, instead of just jumping off a building, he decided to go ahead and open fire at a congressional baseball game and targeting Republicans. Complete coincidence. And then, of course, you had an assassin who came after Justice Kavanaugh, and now you had an assassin who came after President Trump. None of this is an accident. You know, with Islamic terrorism, which I do quite a bit of, they talk about lone wolves. No, this has nothing to do with some broader thing. It's just this guy, you know, he had issues, the Times Square bomber. He had financial problems. You know, this guy, the guy who came to Times Square with a machete on New Year's Eve after converting to Islam. No. You know, I mean, he had a troubled childhood. There's always an excuse. It's always a lone wolf. No, there's an overall infrastructure. There's a permission structure. There's a training structure. These people are told, this is who you go after. And our version of Islamic terrorism is the left. It's the left that has been coming over after, and it's been telling these people, this is who you come after. This is who you want to shoot. This is who you take out to save America. And as bad as it is, you know, going back to the McKinley assassination, the age of anarchists, you know, we call the left different things at different periods. We used to call them woke. A few years ago, the left was calling itself woke, and now nobody on the left will call themselves woke. The only people who use the term woke are people who hate wokes. So the left has to constantly keep changing its name like a chameleon. And back then you were calling them anarchists. And what the anarchists did was engage in some of the largest domestic terror operations in this country. Beyond trying to assassinating a president, assassinating other public officials, they carried out a major bombing in New York City on Wall Street, which people have kind of forgotten about. They've also were carrying out terrorist operations across the country. Then we kind of forgot about all of that. And this is something that's been with us since the very beginning. And that's part of what my book is about. I call it a 1619 project for the American left. Because the left created a 1619 project for us. They wanted to tell our story. But the left is never interested in telling their story, which is kind of funny. The left loves doing histories of everything. History of why milk is racist. The history of why highways are racist. But what about a history of the American left? You know, they're suddenly very quiet about that. They will do maybe things from the 60s, from the 50s, but they don't want to do a comprehensive history of the American left, so I very graciously and kindly stepped in and did that for them. And what I did is I told the story of the left from the very beginning, how the left was always here to take over, to destroy America, and it has the same premises then that it does now. Its premises are very simple. It believes that it can create an ideal, a perfect society if you give it absolute power. We're here, as Karen mentioned, on Bastille Day, and there's a sharp distinction between the July 4th, the Declaration of Independence, and what the premises of the French Revolution were. Bastille Day was a bloody, murderous campaign set off by the Marquis de Sade, a lovely gentleman who was into every horrifying thing that is now normal in San Francisco. He would have been very enthused by the fact that there are now 79 genders. He would have been inventing another one every single day. And he set off this violent, bloody attack on a prison where it was claimed that people were being tortured. In reality, there was nobody being tortured in prison. The vast majority of the people there were criminals, and there were 7 of them. They killed over 100 people to get to these 7 criminals. And this is what they celebrate year after year after year. So you're wondering why the French voted in communists and Islamists and Marxists. Well, this is Bastille Day, because this is still the revolution that they believe in. And this is the revolution that we believe in. What we believe in as a revolution in individual liberty. What the French believe in, what the left believes in, is a complete, total revolution to impose government power on all of us. In the Declaration of Independence, we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the individual pursuit of happiness. The French promised that they would impose happiness. They would create the universal happiness of mankind. No, individual happiness, one-size-fits-all happiness. The government is going to create absolute happiness. You will get this happiness. You will like this happiness. There are no options. It's like the joke about Henry Ford. You can have a Ford in every color as long as it's black. You can have happiness in every color as long as it's LGBTQ, as long as it's BLM, as long as you put up the signs outside your house, as long as you're happy with Bidenomics having to pay 30% more for groceries. As long as you accept the left's premises, you can have happiness. You cannot dissent from those premises. You cannot disagree with them. That is not allowed. And that is really where the source of the violence comes from. We talk about tolerance, we talk about extremism and moderation, everybody's coming now. Everybody needs to dial it back. Everybody needs to lower the temperature. Everybody needs to speak more nicely and mellifluously and say things like, I respect the other side. I disagree with them on some things, but I respect the other side. Rhetoric is not how you actually create mutual tolerance. You actually have to agree to disagree. The left does not agree to disagree.
Right.
The left believes that it alone has all the answers. It believes that it can heal all the sick. It can feed every hungry child in the world. It can create a golden age for mankind. And what would you not do if you believe you can do that? If you can save millions of children from going hungry, if you can heal all the sick, if you can end racism, war, poverty. Shooting one guy, shooting President Trump, what's the big deal? It's practically a moral thing to do. And if you understand that, you also understand the left, and this is who the left has been from the beginnings of this country. And that is why I wrote this book, because it is important to understand, first of all, where the left comes from, second of all, how long it has been at it, and third of all, because we actually need hope. When I wrote this book, it was 2020, the summer of love. And people were saying, no, the founding fathers never dealt with this, the age of the Constitution, we never dealt with this, we could not beat this. The reality is we've been fighting this from the very beginning. One of my favorite scenes in the book actually has George Washington, who becomes the only president to command troops in the field. There's a history there before President Trump. President Trump is carrying on this proud history of actually fighting in the streets. And George Washington goes ahead. He becomes the first president to actually lead troops against a leftist insurrection by one of the democratic societies. Does that name sound familiar? It gives birth to the Democratic Party eventually. One of these democratic societies, and he calls it the first foul fruits of this that may be their undoing. He goes out, he commands troops. The founding fathers were not afraid to fight the left. And President Trump is reclaiming that heritage today of not being afraid to fight the left.
Bravo. Yeah, exactly right. In the book, you talk about, in the very beginning, just to bring it to 2020, how already the left in 1800 was exploiting yellow fever, a pandemic, in order to seize control, because it's what the left does. And you put that in the context also of the notion of independence, individual independence, but also this idea of freedoms, and where does the government step in order to grant us what they think that we need. So they're coming in, they're going to provide water, but it turns out that that's all, it's all exploitative, and it's all in the name of our health, right? Sound familiar? And also the contrast, you also talk about, in that context, how the revolution to most of the founders who we think of as our true philosophical, ideological founding premises is, we had this revolution, now it's over, now what do we do to create this country? We have the Constitution and so on, but to the left, revolution is constant.
Yes.
And it's just absolutely, the war is over per se, but the revolution must continue because we have to aim for this utopian situation. And you talk about Aaron Burr at that time, and there's just a straight through line, as you mentioned now, to exactly where we are now. It cracks me up when they call themselves progressive, because there's literally nothing new. In centuries, not only that, but a lot of those early thoughts were pre-Marxist, pre-Lenin, any of those names that we associate with socialism, communism, and they were doing this already. And then we can talk about Rhode Island too, but can you talk to us about what Aaron Burr tried to do, and how he's the sort of the father of a lot of the evils that we're dealing with?
Absolutely. To break down what the left does is it identifies a crisis, it holds out a solution. The solution, of course, involves giving it absolute power. Saving the planet is obviously the latest iteration of that, but they're everything. Homelessness, they create a crisis, they identify the crisis, then they step in, give us total power, and we will absolutely fix this. And as Southern Californians, how's that going? So I actually look back at when a lot of this started in America, which is the 1800 presidential election. A guy named Aaron Burr, who comes to be remembered for killing Alexander Hamilton, but at that point he's trying to become president of the United States. And he has a great idea. There's a pandemic, yellow fever. George Washington has to evacuate the Capitol. Thomas Jefferson is sleeping on the floor of an inn because there's no room. Alexander Hamilton himself is sick. There is this crisis. People are afraid. They don't know what's causing this. And Aaron Burr comes up with a solution, which is not to cure the problem, but to create a way to put a whole lot more people on the voting rolls in the name of curing the problem, which is so very contemporary. I was writing this in 2020, as mentioned. He teams up with a group known as Tammany Hall, a merry group of pranksters who become the core of the Democratic Party. And what they come up with is, we're going to give you clean water. We're going to give you clean water at very reasonable prices. We just need a monopoly on water. What could possibly go wrong? Well, they don't actually give you any kind of water. What they do is they actually create a bank. Then they use the bank to loan out money to their political supporters. They put a lot of people on the voting rolls, and they swing the presidential election. At that point, Aaron Burr comes up with yet another great plan, which is throw the election to the House of Representatives and get the House of Representatives to actually make him president. This he does not actually succeed at doing, in part thanks to the intervention of Alexander Hamilton. But he does create the urban democratic political machine called Tammany Hall and others like it, which become really the machine that runs the Democratic Party, including a minor city known as Los Angeles. All this really stems from over 200 years ago. So the techniques that the left uses to control us have been in place all this time. The Founding Fathers were aware of them. They actually built the Constitution in part and other legislation to stop them from doing all of this. The Alien and Sedition Acts get a bad rap, but the Alien and Sedition Acts were an attempt to stop foreign radicals from coming into the United States and subverting the country. They were dealing with this 200 years ago. Abigail Adams, in a very compelling letter, actually discusses how America is the only alternative to the French Revolution model because only we have the sort of liberty as opposed to the French sort of liberty. And our liberty is dependent on, first of all, the idea that our rights come from God. They don't come from government. The left's idea is that our rights come from government. So do we give total power to God, or do we give total power to government? That is really the fundamental question here. The left believes that God is government, that they can become as gods, that they can actually rearrange all of our lives if they do it, if they follow the science. And they follow the science, they follow whatever it is they're following, it always crashes. Karen mentioned a moment ago progressives. They constantly have to keep changing their name. What kind of people have to constantly keep changing their name? Yeah, think about it for a moment. They're always changing their name. They're liberals, they're progressives, anarchists, wokes. Give them 5-10 years, they're going to have a new name in place because the old name gets so tainted. Conservatives are not constantly changing our name. Yet every time liberal, Rush Limbaugh helped make liberal absolutely toxic, so they looked around for a new name. Now woke has become absolutely toxic, they're going to come up with a new name. They're always coming up with new names because their ideas are really old and really bad. And Domestic Enemies is a history of those old, really bad ideas and how we fought them and how we can win against them again.
And the idea of our rights coming from God and protected by the Constitution is yet another one of those major differences completely with any other constitution, but certainly with the French Revolution. As you were saying, the state became God and will grant those things that people have decided are important. But the idea that man can do this rather than God that's completely antithetical to everything we believe. So the French Revolution was in a sense doomed from the beginning, if that's the goal of the state, if that's the goal of man to do this, because now man is the arbiter of everything, which is, where the guillotines came in. Mm-hmm. And all their heroes wind up losing heads. You talk about Genet,
yes.
French revolutionary type who tried to foment equal dissent and chaos in this country, but he was not successful and kind of run out. But that's back when we were.
Yeah. He does create the Democratic Party, so arguably
Yeah.
he was pretty successful.
Yeah, can you tell us, how, when I was reading this, I thought, I mean, he was community organizer par excellence, and it was, no pun intended, and it was quite horrifying, but he very much wanted to model the United States on France. Even though we had already won our revolution, he wanted us to follow the French revolutionary model.
So the French Revolution of the day was as the Communist Revolution was in the early 20th century. There was a division over whether the American Revolution was just going to end with the Constitution or not. Or was there going to be an empire of liberty, which was a term that some American radicals had taken to using. Now, the idea of the empire of liberty is you're going to expand liberty around the world. This should sound familiar because it's been a favorite obsession of certain people in Washington, D.C. We're going to spread American liberty around the world. We try to do this in Iraq and Afghanistan. I know my favorite was when they put on, I think the play 1776 in Iraq to explain to the Iraqis, how all the stuff works. And if you don't share the basic cultural premises, it's really not going to work for you in the first place. The American Revolution, the American idea of individualism and independence was not going to work for anybody except the people who shared some of the American cultural premises, some of the Western cultural premises. And even attempting to export the American Revolution to France failed very badly. The French decided to have their own revolution instead. Jefferson actually helped General Lafayette write up a version of the Declaration of Independence meant for the French. And they kind of said, oh, thank you very much. We're going to take a look at this. We don't really like you very much. We're going to table this. Then Bastille Day comes along, and they end up pre-writing this. The guy who ends up pre-writing it, Abbé, who starts out as a French monk, later disavows the whole religion because the French Revolution creates the cult of the supreme being. He later disavows even that. His response to what did you do during the Great Terror was, I lived, which is a great line. Then he helps bring Napoleon to power. So those are the French founding fathers as opposed to the American founding fathers. Lafayette, by the way, has to flee France. He gets taken prisoner in Austria, and there's a whole plan by some of the American figures, including Hamilton's sister-in-law, actually to break him out of prison in Austria. They have this whole plan. They send an American doctor there. It backfires. One of the first international hostage rescue operations, arguably. But anyway, the French founding fathers go to the guillotine, as Karen said. The whole thing turns into a bloody mess. But some Americans still cling to this idea of the empire of liberty. And the French radicals also embrace the idea of empire of liberty. They like this idea. They're going to spread the French Revolution around the world, but they're also going to take it to America. America tried to spread our revolution to France, and the French said, no, we're going to spread our revolution to you. And a guy named Citizen Genet, who's basically the French ambassador, comes here. He starts forming liaisons with various American radicals, including a guy by the name of George Logan, who gives his name to the Logan Act, under which John Kerry and so many Democrats should have been indicted for actually were taking it seriously, but that's a whole sidebar there. And he proposes that they create these organizations in every city, and they want to call them Sons of Liberty after the American Revolution. He proposes democratic societies. And that eventually gives its name to the Democratic part of the Democratic Republican Party. The Democrat part tend to be the radicals. And they're allying with the French Revolution. They want to actually bring the French Revolution to America. They feel that it's incomplete. They want to create what we would today call equity. Make sure that everybody is level, everybody is absolutely equal. Levelers, by the name, was a really old name for also leftists, because this has been going on for even more than 200 years. They embrace this idea of we are going to bring the guillotine to America. We're going to remove George Washington from office, and we're going to create this perfect society in America. And we kind of briefly touched on why all leftist revolutions devolve into violence. If you believe you're going to create the perfect society, well, you're never going to accomplish it. So you're never going to actually reach that goal. If your goal is to give everybody political freedoms and rights, well, you can actually do that. And we did that. If your goal is to create a perfect society, you're never going to get there. You're going to engage in constant bloodshed in pursuit of doing that. And so really from very early on, the two lanes were set. You had the people who were influenced by the French Revolution, who were the Democrats, and their goal was to create a perfect society in America, to eliminate all distinctions. And part of what my book does is actually trace this into the Civil War, where they pursue this effort to create this perfect society by any means. And those people who, we call them today conservatives, but really those are the people who believe in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, whose idea is you're going to give people individual freedoms, individual powers from the government, not through the government.
Revolutionary.
Indeed.
Yeah, and what you take us through is that progression, to use the word, of the bifurcation of thinking and how the revolution must be continued. But part of that is, if you have this notion of utopia, it is perfectly legitimate to demonize anyone standing in the way, as they had demonized George Washington. I was completely unaware of this. I always thought he was, universally beloved, but no, these organizations really demonized George Washington, and any, echoes to right now. I mean, Donald Trump is Hitler. Could there be a more obvious means of demonizing someone who is pro our basic tenets, pro-liberty, pro-freedom, pro-rights from God, pro our founding notions and ideologies? You demonize that person who's pro-make America great. You demonize them if you have as this aim, this never attainable utopian vision. So they were going after George Washington. There were cartoons, if I recall, of him being brought to the guillotine. So, right? I mean, the power of the media, the power of these messages, really, it can be its own infection, its own infestation. And, to what we just saw yesterday, we don't know exactly how it happened, but you beat the drum of he's in the way of perfection, Trump is Hitler, it becomes the right thing to do to stop him. So was the sense kind of the same at that time?
No. I actually did an article some years back, every Republican is Hitler. I went back to every, Republican presidential candidate, good or bad, and there would always be somebody there calling him Hitler, no matter who he was.
Yeah.
It would be Mitt Romney, it would be George W. Bush, he's Hitler. It really doesn't matter. They could run the most liberal Republican around. They could run Liz Cheney on the Republican line, and suddenly she'd be Hitler. So it was absolutely, and it really just got started. One of the interesting things about the New York Post, which we have the blessing of having around because they were the only ones to actually publish Hunter Biden's laptop, and they're the only really major newspaper, old school newspaper that is still doing this stuff. And do you know who set up the New York Post? Alexander Hamilton, all the way back. Yeah, it's I think one of the oldest, if not the oldest newspapers in America. And it was created in response to the Democratic efforts to create their own hate press, whose goal was, yes, to, as you mentioned, take down George Washington, take down any kind of political opposition. Alexander Hamilton decided, we actually need to fight back. We need to create a paper. Most of the papers they created actually disappeared, went out of business. They ended up taking over some of our papers. A few days ago, I was actually talking to people. I was actually reading a segment of the book from the last chapter where Winston Churchill's grandfather, who's an American, by the way, is there during the draft riots during the Civil War. He's got a Gatling gun, and they set it up in the New York Times, which back then is actually the epicenter of the Republican Party. The New York Times actually later gets taken over by Democrats, but back then it's a Republican paper, and there was this huge mob of Democrats coming to destroy it, and they set up these Gatling guns to protect the newspaper. They were not for gun control then. So this has always been here, and the left set up its own media. Those media operations ultimately failed where they're failing now. But what they ended up doing was they ended up taking some Republican conservative papers over the years and turning them into the left. You would never look at the New York Times now and know what it was. You would never think that. It was actually taken over by not only Democrats, but the Ox-Sulzberg family, who were Confederate sympathizers. Anyway, I don't want to jump too far ahead in time, but yes, this was absolutely an issue. Part of the Alien and Sedition Acts were based around this idea that you had foreign radicals coming to America, and they were bringing European radicalism then. You know, I've mentioned various names that the left went under. Around the 1820s, one of the names they went under were communists. They went under communists because they were setting up communes. And they held property in common, so you didn't have any private property. You were supposed to give all your property to everybody. In practice, of course, it didn't work out that way, and most of those communes ended up failing. One of the names they used was communists.
And historically, to the communism point and to them being straight out about just language, there's a whole big chapter about Rhode Island. Now that touches me particularly, having lived for 18 years in Rhode Island, and it never seemed to play a particularly big role in our history, but come to find out, it actually played a huge role in our history. If you could tell us a little bit about how they went to paper currency that was separate from all the rest of the currency. They forced people to use it, but the part that I really wanted to talk about is they had an act called the Forcing Act. I mean, how straightforward can you be? That, right? How obvious that we just passed this law that says we are forcing you to use this kind of currency, or else we're going to run you out. We're going to close you down. And businesses who tried to stay a going concern really ran into trouble by not the Forcing Act. It's kind of an astounding thing. And when we think about government doing this or that, these days they couch it in all kinds of language of compassion, and the Help the Children Act and the Clean Water Act and the this act, but the Forcing Act, boom, here it is. Can you tell us about that?
So back then, around the time of the Constitution, Rhode Island had a problem we absolutely cannot relate to: inflation. There was a party that came to power called the Country Party, and their motto was to relieve the distressed. What could possibly go wrong? They will relieve the distress by printing a whole lot of paper currency and creating a massive wealth transfer by forcing businesses to accept the currency at their stated value rather than the actual value, which was, according to James Madison, depreciated 8 to 1. Now, why does any of this matter? We're not in Rhode Island. It's a really tiny place. But it actually almost succeeded in blocking the Constitution, because we have this image of the Constitutional Convention. Everybody got there, they argued a bit, and they all signed off on it. In reality, none of the states were all there at the same time. George Washington showed up bright and early. He's a military guy. He comes there. Nobody else is there. It takes forever to get enough states to show up and then sign up in terms, because you don't want to be in Philly over the summer. Rhode Island never shows up. The Country Party refuses to send emissaries. Everybody else signs off on the Constitution. George Washington becomes president. Rhode Island is still boycotting it, which means Rhode Island is technically not part of the United States. And parts of Rhode Island, the non-leftist parts, the parts that are not benefiting from the Forcing Act, which, by the way, went ahead and actually stated that if you did not accept the currency, you had to swear an oath to accept the currency. Oh. If you did not swear this oath, then we would prevent it from voting, from running for public office, from being able to practice law, from doing any number of things. And at that point, George Washington, Adams basically say enough is enough. You're either going to join the United States or you're going to be treated as enemies outside the United States. Those parts of Rhode Island that actually want to join the United States would be welcomed in. The other parts, well, at that point, the Country Party is flirting with the idea of having their own socialist setup. They're looking at having state-owned enterprises. They think, okay, we're going to use all this money we're printing to create state-owned enterprises, and then we're going to do our own fishing. The government would do its own fishing, and what can possibly go wrong with this? Anyway, they're given a pretty clear ultimatum, and they agree to actually stop printing their own fake money and join the United States. And from then on in, we never have a problem with the government printing infinite amounts of money. Never happens again.
But it was really tenuous at the time. I mean, we know how it turns out, that the 13 colonies were all states, and it became the United States of America, and the Constitution was ratified. But it really was touch and go for a good long while there, because what if Rhode Island isn't part of the United States? They had foreign ships coming in, and Rhode Island wasn't levying taxes as the rest of the country did. So ships could come in, Rhode Island could then charge to other people the various taxes and tariffs. So it was kind of a dangerous thing on the one hand, and then at the same time, weren't they talking about every 13 years dividing everything among everybody?
Yeah, they began going absolutely crazy. There was supposedly a scheme where they were going to redistribute the wealth every period. And they were concerned because also Rhode Island might become a British port, at which point you've got America's enemies sitting right there next door.
Right there, right.
So again, they did not take this lying down, they fought.
And then George Washington prevailed, which is...
There's a lesson there.
There's a lesson there. So when we are determined...
Yes. If you can't fight, you cannot win.
That's right.
That's a lesson for Republicans.
And also another lesson is never surrender.
Yeah.
And we're, right?
Never give up the ship.
Never give up the ship. So we had Rhode Island, the forcing act. I just still can't wrap my mind around that, literally, the forcing act. Nationalism and globalism were issues that they were facing as well. Make America great, not again, but at that time, or make it great versus the globalist forces. Can you talk to us about that?
So there was the idea of the Empire of Liberty, which was what is the American Revolution for? Is it for America? Or is it for liberating the rest of the world? And this is something that actually I describe in the book. It starts at the very beginning. Jefferson initially likes to use the term Empire of Liberty, and then he really sees what France is doing and decides, okay, this idea of a transnational empire that includes the French Revolution, the American Revolution, really might not work so well. But all sorts of Europeans now start promoting the idea of the Empire of Liberty. One of the more insane stories actually in this book is, I believe, chapter 4, where I discuss the origin of this whole Aryan idea, the Aryan master race. And it's actually coming out of two folks who are German immigrants, because the French Revolution produces radicals and they come to America. Various English radicals come to America, and then it's the turn of Germany when they have their revolution in the 40s. And a whole bunch of these radicals actually come to America. They play a major role in helping bring on the American Civil War. And two of these guys are working in a Democrat administration, the Pierce administration, I believe. And they write this book about how America really needs to conquer the entire world and create this massive global empire of freedom. And they also create another book about this idea that there is an Aryan race that originated from India, from Tibet, and spread around the world. They actually help originate the concept of the Aryan race, the Aryan master race. And this obviously ends up being picked up later by actual Germans in Germany, or an Austrian in Germany at any rate, and being used to help create National Socialism. So there are all sorts of radicals and extremists who like this idea of influencing America to intervene. The Statue of Liberty, by the way, why do we have the Statue of Liberty? This is Americans at the time were pretty baffled by this because they shipped us this really giant statue. It was not green at the time, it was actually very shiny and bright. It later turns green from being exposed to a whole lot of sea air in the very clean waters of New York Harbor. But it's actually meant to influence this idea that America would intervene in France, that would intervene in Europe, and Americans basically say, no thank you. Part of the poem that's used to promote immigration now is basically saying, if you guys really want to come here, that's an option. We're not going to go over there and transform your societies. We're not going to fight wars around the world to remove all the kings. And this is something that really is at the heart of globalism, whether it's neoconservatism, whether it's various other movements that propose using American forces just to spread liberty around the world, then you cannot do it. It makes sense to intervene if we are threatened, but not because we're going to create this perfect society through nation building. It never works. It simply does not work.
And we somehow, I'm always puzzled by this idea, let alone where you're talking about spreading democracy everywhere, but this idea that conservatism as an idea should be caught on by everyone. Well, what's conservative to us is our founders. What's conservative to somewhere else is, as you had mentioned before, it's their origin, their roots, their culture. That's to conserve, India, or to conserve Austria as an entirely, or France. Just the very word conservatism, we get so peeved at other countries for not embracing conservatism, but we don't want them to embrace their conservatism. We want them to embrace ours. So it's a tricky sell that we don't even understand that is a thing that we need to discuss.
Yeah. Well, American conservatism, what we call American conservatism, is really what used to be known as liberalism before all this went absolutely crazy.
Right, that's right.
And it's really about affirming the centrality of the Constitution and that or original vision, as opposed to a lot of the things we sometimes debate. The left is opposed to that vision, and when we try to talk to some European conservatives are actually also follow the liberal tradition. Others are actually promoting a kind of fascism or even National Socialism.
Yeah.
And when we go to the Muslim world, well, their conservatism is keep every woman from the age of 7 wearing a burqa, and that's obviously not something we are so much fond of.
Right.
Much as we talk about the Reformation within Christianity and the Reformation within Islam, it produced very dramatically different results. These analogies are often false analogies because we really don't focus on what America believes, on what Americans believe, and what our values and our culture are. We treat it just as an interchangeable idea. It's just an idea. Well, it's not just an idea. It's an idea rooted in a whole lot of history and culture. And if we cut off that history and culture, none of it makes sense.
None of it makes sense. And not only was it rooted in that, but there was blood spilled.
Yes.
We fought for this. People fought and died for these ideas. So how would we consider that somehow transportable to anywhere that simply doesn't have this in their DNA, as we absolutely do? So when you watched the European elections, just what was your thinking?
Well, I'm very glad that we did not adopt the European parliamentary system.
Yes.
However, there is one pro from the European parliamentary system, because in the European parliamentary system, there would just be a non-confidence vote and Biden would be gone.
That's true.
On the other hand, there'd be a no-confidence vote and he'd be replaced by somebody who could actually win an election.
Yes.
So maybe it's good that we don't have the European parliamentary system. Look, France is a fundamentally troubled country. It's been fundamentally troubled since its origins.
Yeah.
And this is really why you have to look at the roots of the country, and that's part of why I wrote this history. You have to look at the origins to understand where society comes from and what its values are. If you look back at the contrast between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, you understand why France is going to continue to be troubled and why America actually does have hope, and why so many of the people in Europe actually turn toward America as an example, as a model. And when we run down our system, when we run down what we have to offer, and there are so many John Kerrys in America, and they go to Europe and they say, no, we're so provincial, we're so terrible. We need to learn more from you about how to do things. We need to be more European. We need to go around everywhere wearing sandals and shorts. We too need to have mistresses without apologizing for it. That actually is the opposite of America's gift to the world. Ronald Reagan said it very clearly that America was the last best hope for freedom. We still are the last best hope for freedom. And Europeans who are wiser recognize this and turn to America. And when we turn on them, we say, no, we want to learn from you. We want to learn also how to have communists and Islamists and fascists in our houses of parliament. We too want to learn from you how to have riots nonstop. Well, we're learning pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah, watching the parliamentary system has been really quite a lesson for all of us. But one of the things, the French Revolution, Bastille Day, and so on that you described, that's in their past and so on, and 14th of July and La Marseillaise and all of this. But what floors me is that it is still the day that they celebrate. Mm-hmm. We celebrate the 4th of July as Independence Day because it truly is the birth of the ideology and of everything that's our roots of this country. Bastille Day then turned into these bloody massacres for a long time, unbelievable slaughter, guillotines, complete disruption. Then they wind up with Napoleon and just how that all goes. And it's still what they hark to.
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Well, Bastille Day is the origin of the left. By the way, does anybody know where the left came from, the term the left? Anybody?
Read the book.
France.
It's from France.
So when they actually create their... Yeah. It is evil, but when they create their legislature, their initial revolutionary legislature, the people who are the radicals sit on the left. And that's actually where the terms the left and the right come from. The people who are more conservative sit on the right. The people who are the radicals sit on the left. That's actually where we get the term the left, which is a very strange term because if you think about it, left generally has bad connotations in most languages, yet the left embraces this. They embrace the idea of being the contrarians, the enemies, the opponents, and they still embrace that identity. They actually relish and glory. You look at these Twitter and on other social media, these celebrations of President Trump being wounded, being nearly killed. They celebrate this violence, they celebrate this ugliness. That's another reason, by the way, why leftist revolutions spiral into internal violence, because they actually are attracted to the violence. They're not a whole lot of them are not actually trying to create a perfect society. They want either a bloody dictatorship that they run or they want perpetual violence. And thus, in the French Revolution, you had the Reign of Terror. In the Russian Revolution, you end up with the Bolsheviks purging everybody else and then purging each other until you finally have a strong man who puts a stop to it. Otherwise, the bloodshed and the killing just goes on. And that's also why I predicted whatever else is going to happen here, it's going to be violence because that is what the left does. Whether it's Bastille Day, whether it's the attempted assassination of President Trump, it's always violence.
So the left was the radicals, the right was the conservatives, not big government, smaller government, which is how we've sort of translated it. But it still holds. We're still the conservatives, even if we're not really thinking in terms of smaller government, even if we're not really thinking as much in terms of individual rights and so on. And they are still the radicals, even though they couch themselves in DEI and egalitarianism and all of this. It's still radical. No. So how do we, aside from never surrendering, how do we combat this?
So Make America Great Again is a profoundly conservative slogan. It recognizes that we are not where we once were. We actually need to look back to our strengths and bring those strengths back. And the left, on the other hand, believes that there is a right side of history, that they're heading toward it, and that their mission is to drag the rest of us to it by any means necessary. So there are a number of things we need to do. First of all, we need to actually arrest the progress of the left. We need to stop the further descent. We need to stop the damage, and that's obviously important. Second is Make America Great Again. We actually need to bring back America's strengths. Because all too often, sometimes the conservative movement or Republicans or whatever descend into this notion where we're reacting to the left. And you can't just react to the left. If you react to the left, you're going to end up losing. And there are parts of the conservative movement that kind of have become a mirror image of the left because they're really focused on what is the left doing now. And people also get turned off by it. It's just this constant doom and gloom. This is what the left is doing there. This is what it's doing over here. And I am an investigative journalist, so I do spend a lot of time writing about that. And often people tell me, you are depressing us. It's just so depressing. They're doing this here, they're doing this there. And that's one of the reasons I actually wrote Domestic Enemies, because it actually looks back at where all this started, and it looks back what our strengths were and actually how we fought them at various junctures. And we actually, yes, we absolutely need to fight them. We need to arrest them. But we also need to create our own better system. When Abigail Adams wrote that America was the best position to stop the French Sword of Liberty, because America was creating something different, an alternative. In Europe, there were plenty of conservatives who were fighting to uphold monarchies. I'm not going to take a position on monarchies, except I absolutely do not want one in America. The idea of the monarchy was you wouldn't just have some crazy guy who was sitting in office despite being senile and demented simply because of his last name. And our system is not working so well in that regard. But the American system actually created something better. It was an alternative. This is why America has always threatened the left. The left originally embraced class warfare. We crushed class warfare originally because we provided strong incomes. We have provided the ability of people to come to this country, people who had been in this country, who had been struggling farmers for 3 generations, to come up and move up into the middle class. So many of us who are sitting here have our own stories, those of our ancestors, about how they actually rose through the system. And this is really part of what America offers. It's not the only thing. We mustn't make the kind of mistake of liberal Republicans who say, the big idea here is that immigrants can come to America and we give a green card to anybody here. That's a whole other conversation that could go for an hour on that. But it is one of the things that we offer. America broke class warfare. At that point, the left had to create various identity politics movements, LGBTQ, focus on amping up black grievances, La Raza for Latinos, so on and so forth. They had to do that because class warfare had fallen apart for the most part. America did that. No other country did that. Europe did not do that. America did that. America showed that actually when you follow our approach, you actually can destroy class warfare. We can destroy various leftist arguments in the same way by actually making America great, by actually making America strong, by actually unleashing the potential and power of the United States.
And because we had broken that, which was their go-to, of course, class warfare, divide and conquer, all these other new ways of dividing, as you say, the race and then the LGBTQ, it's all, none of it is to do what they say it's to do. All of it is to divide. All of it is to to breed this notion of victimhood. So that we then turn to the state for, right?
Yes.
So we're at each other's throats and we're looking to the state for handouts and intervention and so on, which is now the European model too.
Yes.
Right? That's exactly what they're doing, and they're way ahead of us in a lot of this regard. In writing the book, did you depress yourself, or did you find that, you know, things were really bad then, and we've learned lessons, or did it make you feel more optimistic from where we are now, or do you think you learned lessons about how to move forward better, or was it just it's too late?
I was writing in 2020, in the year of the summer of love, and everybody was very depressed. This book was actually meant to be uplifting, and I believe it is. You know, you discussed President Trump's attempted assassination and how we have a sigh of relief, we have a sense of strength that emerges from that. You know, we are afraid of crises. Obviously, as individuals, we don't want to challenge ourselves. We don't want to walk into a crisis situation in many cases. There's a sense of, you know, we want a kind of a safety, and conservatives certainly can be conservative in that regard. We can actually want our comfort zones. But you do have to confront, you have to actually engage with the crisis. You have to, as the old term was, bring the crisis to its moment. The Founding Fathers understood that. They were willing to actually confront and push affairs. And that is an important lesson that we learned from things. The thing that is the crisis can be painful, it can be shattering. Obviously, a life was lost. 2 other lives will potentially be lost. We've undergone a bit of a national trauma from the Trump assassination, but it is also a source of strength. And this was really the American perspective. We underwent so many traumatic dislocations. We turned the country upside down over and over again. Until, you know, the World War II era, we've been turning the country nonstop upside down in every generation, and we were the envy of the world because we were doing that. To actually, you know, make America great again, to bring back America, to save America, we are going to have these crisis points over and over again. And this book charts some of that. It charts some of the confrontations. It shows that actually we can confront a crisis, and win or lose, we can emerge stronger from it. You know, one thing we can learn from the left, I'm not that big on learning things from the left, but the left is actually very much willing to embrace crises. It's willing to embrace revolutions. It's willing to push the Overton window. We are often more hesitant in doing that. We're afraid. Certainly liberal Republicans are very afraid. They treat everything as being made out of china or fragile glass. We can't break this. We can't do that. What will happen if we do that? And when Trump came down that escalator, he broke a lot of stuff. And you know, when you break some things, there will be damage as a result. But I think a fundamental lesson that I think we can all agree on is we're not going to get to where we want to get to by playing it safe.
Yeah.
And that is really the message of Domestic Enemies. We're not going to get there by playing it safe. The Founding Fathers did not get there. We did not survive a 200-plus year war against the left by playing it safe. And we've been losing the war by playing it safe.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely true. Our revolution, too, different from ones in the past. It was not conducted by men who had nothing to lose. Mm-hmm. These were all men who had everything to lose, and still they took these tremendous treasonous steps, and we are the heirs of that. And to watch how we have sort of sunk into complacency in a way, and as you say, we're afraid to face up to things. Do you feel now is really the time past time, but certainly now, we don't get that luxury at all anymore. No. What just happened yesterday was kind of a mark of we don't get to do that anymore.
The Founding Fathers, who were generally men of wealth, men of accomplishment, of success, pledged their fortunes in their sacred honor. And that is something, people are very impressed when they see President Trump, who is a billionaire, who dived into this, who fought this, who's now, very clearly nobody can deny he's risked his life for this.
Yes.
This is very much something that goes back to America's founding, the willingness of people to step up and to actually fight, to fight in the trenches. I don't want to, promote any particular vice president either, but you've got J.D. Vance, who was a very successful figure who went ahead and decided again to jump into politics when he did not need to. But obviously, win or lose, poor or wealthy, we all do what we can because that is what this country was also built on. We should not despair. When we actually see crisis points, we should not actually give up hope or think that this is so horrible. We should actually be willing to roll with the punches and actually tack into the wind sometimes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, honestly. And I have to say that I found it hugely optimistic also. It helps to know the really bad stuff that happened in the past that helps us put the bad things of the present in context and know it's not over and how people overcame them. Thank you so much. I mean, just exceptional. Thank you.